By 8 on an April morning, 3 pickup trucks had already slowed along County Road 214. The first rolled past with its windows down, tires whispering over loose gravel. The second nearly stopped beside the Carter fence. The third lingered long enough for Emily Carter to see 2 faces turn toward the pond before the truck coughed out a cloud of exhaust and disappeared around the bend. Down by the water, a white hatchery truck stood crooked in the mud. A thick rubber hose ran from its rear tank to the edge of a 7-acre pond that had spent most of the last decade collecting cattails, fallen branches, and jokes. Emily braced the hose against her hip. Cold water surged through it. Then the fish came. Small channel catfish slid into the pond in silver-gray waves, their bodies knocking softly against one another before vanishing beneath the brown surface. The hose trembled in Emily's hands. Water soaked the knees of her jeans and ran into her boots. 5,000, 7,000, 10,000. When the final tank emptied, the driver lifted the hose and muddy water slapped back against the bank. The sudden quiet felt enormous. Behind Emily, the truck's diesel engine rattled. Somewhere beyond the barn, a red-winged blackbird called from a fence post. The air smelled of wet clay, fish water, and the faint sweetness of spring grass beginning to grow along the ditch. The hatchery truck pulled away. Emily did not watch it leave. She opened the spiral notebook tucked into the back pocket of her jeans. Water temperature, wind direction, stocking time, estimated depth near the spillway. 4 painted stakes went into the shoreline, each pushed deep enough to survive the first hard rain. Then Emily stood with both boots in the mud and stared across the pond. Nothing moved. 10,000 fish were down there now. So was nearly every dollar she had left. 3 months earlier, Emily had not been thinking about fish. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her father's bank statements spread around a cold cup of coffee. The house was silent except for the refrigerator motor and the small metallic ticking of the furnace pipes. Her father's chair still faced the window. Daniel Carter had died in December after 2 years of failing health, leaving behind a half-repaired tractor, a barn roof that leaked near the south corner, 74 acres of tired ground, and debts Emily had known existed but had never understood. The first statement made her sit straighter. The second made her stop drinking the coffee. By the third, she had pulled a yellow legal pad from the junk drawer and started adding figures. $43,000 remained on the farm note. Nearly $16,000 had to be brought current before the end of the coming harvest season. There were unpaid fertilizer bills, property taxes, a repair loan, a feed balance. The numbers crowded the paper until the page looked darker than it should have. Outside, winter rain tapped against the kitchen window. Emily turned the pencil around and rubbed the eraser over one total until the paper grew thin. Then she added it again. The number did not change. For the next week, the kitchen table became a map of everything that could take the farm away. Seed catalogs lay open beside diesel receipts. Corn prices were written in the margins of bank letters. Soybean yield estimates covered the backs of envelopes. Every plan seemed to begin the same way. Spend money first. Hope later. Corn required more fertilizer than she could finance. Soybeans were cheaper, but the previous 2 crops had already disappointed them. Another weak yield would leave nothing between the Carter land and the bank. Renting the ground out would keep the lights on. It would not save the farm. Selling the West 40 would. Emily folded that piece of paper and slid it under a stack of other papers where she would not have to see it. Then she started walking the property. At first, she carried the legal pad. Later, she switched to the small spiral notebook because it fit in her pocket. Before sunrise, frost cracked beneath her boots as she crossed soybean stubble. At midday, she pushed an old soil probe into the ground. At dusk, she followed drainage cuts toward the lower end of the property. The farm showed its age everywhere. Fence posts leaned away from the wire. A hinge groaned on the machine shed whenever the wind shifted. The tractor left a dark line of hydraulic oil wherever it sat too long. Near the barn, one loose gutter banged against the siding at night, and behind all of it sat the pond. It had been dug long before Emily was born. Her father had pumped irrigation water from it during dry summers, but the intake had collapsed years ago. Cattails swallowed one bank. Saplings rooted too close to the dam. The spillway had washed into a shallow gully lined with weeds. From the road, it looked like something the farm had forgotten. Emily began spending more time there. A weighted rope gave her the depth. Fresh boot prints showed where rainwater entered after storms. Dark clay packed under her heel and held together when she squeezed it in her palm. One cold morning, she found a strip along the north bank where the surface had not iced over. She crouched there until the knees of her jeans turned damp. The water moving through that strip was colder than the rest. That evening, while looking for an old equipment deed in the attic, she found the green metal cash box. It was wedged behind a cedar trunk beneath a blanket of dust. The handle was broken. The latch opened only after she worked it with a screwdriver. Inside were 6 notebooks. Her grandfather Walter's name appeared on the first page in faded blue ink. Most of the entries were ordinary farm records. Rainfall, calf weights, corn yields, fuel costs. Halfway through the second notebook, Emily found a hand-drawn cross-section of the pond. She sat down on the attic floor. Dust floated through the narrow beam from the roof vent. Walter had marked the clay layer. The old spillway, the northern seep. Besides several summer dates, he had written water levels. A drought year showed less decline than Emily expected. 2 pages later came rough figures for channel catfish. Stocking numbers, feed estimates, harvest weights, local buyers. The calculations ended halfway down a page. The next sheet went back to cattle. Emily read the unfinished catfish page again. Then a third time. When she climbed downstairs, the notebook smelled like dust and machine oil in her hands. That winter, while the fields sat brown and empty, she studied what Walter had almost done. The work was less romantic than the idea. Fish needed oxygen. Feed could become growth or waste. Warm water could turn dangerous before dawn. Too many fish could ruin a pond faster than too few could make money. Emily filled page after page with figures. 7 acres, 10,000 fingerlings, expected mortality, projected growth, feed conversion, electrical costs, processing fees, transport. 40 miles south, a retired fish farmer had 2 used paddle wheel aerators sitting behind a shed. Rust stained the frames, and one motor had been rewired twice. Emily bought them anyway. A man with a small excavator cleared the spillway. Electrical cable ran toward the pond. The old feed cart got patched and greased. Every purchase made the checking account smaller. Every purchase also made County Road 214 more interested. At the feed store, sacks of floating fish pellets began appearing in the bed of Emily's pickup instead of seed. The diner parking lot went briefly quiet when she crossed it in mud-stained boots. Farm trucks slowed by the Carter place. No one needed to say much. The looks were enough. A 24-year-old woman with a mortgage problem had sold her last 2 beef cows and an old grain drill. Then she had used the money to put fish into a pond. Emily kept her eyes on the work. At dawn came the aerators. Switches clicked beneath cool fingers. Belts hummed. Paddles struck the surface and threw fans of water into the early light. Then came feed. Pellets hit calm water with a soft pattering sound. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the pond broke open. Catfish rolled beneath the surface, pale mouths flashing between bursts of brown water. By May, the feeding circles widened. By June, the feed bills began arriving faster than Emily liked. The price per bag rose. A bearing started to grind in one aerator. A thunderstorm shorted part of the electrical line and left a black scorch mark on the junction box. One afternoon, the old tractor died with half a load of feed beside the pond. Emily turned the key. The starter clicked. Nothing else. Heat shimmered above the hood. 3 hours passed, with Emily bent over the engine while sweat ran from her temples onto hot metal. When the tractor finally started, its exhaust left a bitter taste in the back of her throat. That night, rain came hard. Water drummed against the barn roof and rushed through the repaired spillway. By morning, part of the bank had slumped. Emily loaded gravel into the pickup with a shovel. By the 6th load, her shoulders burned. Mud sucked at her boots each time she climbed the slope. The skin at the base of her right thumb split before noon. No one driving past saw that. From the road, the pond still looked brown. Across the county, corn rose in clean green rows. Soybean fields filled in neatly between tire tracks. Other farmers had crops people could see growing. Emily's crop disappeared the moment it was born. Early summer sampling made the problem worse. The first few fish weights were good. The next were not. Emily wiped pond water from the scale and weighed another. Too small. Another. Better. Another. Small again. The figures in the notebook spread wider than she wanted. That night, under the yellow kitchen light, she changed the projection. Then changed it again. Her pencil slowed at the expected harvest total. She set it down. The refrigerator hummed. A moth struck the screen above the sink, again and again. Beside the notebook sat a bank envelope. Emily slid one finger under the flap, but stopped. For several seconds, she only stared at her father's chair. Then she tore the envelope open. The amount due had not changed. The date had moved closer. 3 feed invoices sat on the counter. So did the electric bill and the estimate for a replacement aerator motor. Emily pulled the calculator toward her. Feed costs, processing, fuel. Survival at 80%. The total fell short. She tried 85. Closer. Still thin. Without warning, the calculator skidded from her hand and struck the coffee cup. Cold coffee ran across the table. It soaked the yellow legal pad, blurred ink, and dripped onto the floor. Emily did not move. For months, every problem had come with a task. A broken belt meant replace the belt. A washed bank meant haul gravel. A bill meant calculate again. That night, there was nothing left to fix with a wrench. Her hand closed around the edge of the table. The first sob came so suddenly that she pressed her lips together as if she could force it back. Another followed. Her shoulders folded. Both hands covered her face. For several minutes, the farm disappeared. No pond, no bank, no oxygen readings. Only her father's empty chair near the window. His boots were still under the coat rack. A dark grease stain remained on the wall where his shoulder used to touch when he bent to pull them on. Emily looked at the chair until the room blurred. She had spent months moving from one job to the next, as if staying busy could keep another thing from leaving. Now, for the first time, she let herself see the auction signs. The tractor gone. The barn emptied. Another family's pickup in the driveway. Her grandfather's pond behind somebody else's fence. Emily bent over the table and cried until the muscles under her ribs hurt. Nothing about it changed the numbers. When the tears finally stopped, she stayed where she was. Coffee had reached the floor and soaked into the edge of the bank statement. Rain ticked softly against the porch roof. Sometime after midnight, Emily wiped the table with an old dish towel. She did not redo the calculations. She left them blurred. At 4:45, the alarm sounded from the bedroom. For several seconds, she did not move. Then the smell of dried coffee reached her from the kitchen. Her eyes felt swollen. She pulled on jeans without turning on the overhead light, found her father's canvas jacket, and walked outside. The farm was dark and damp. Frogs called from the ditch. Wet grass brushed against her boots. Mist floated just above the pond. Emily stood at the shoreline with a flashlight in one hand and a feed scoop in the other. She scattered a small test ration. The pellets landed with faint taps. Nothing happened. She waited. A circle formed near the bank. Then another. The water suddenly rolled. Tails slapped the surface. A dozen fish became 50, then hundreds, pushing beneath one another as the feeding line erupted. The noise filled the quiet morning. Emily lowered the scoop. Her eyes were still red in the flashlight beam. She watched until the last pellet disappeared. Then the notebook came out. The next weeks became less about believing in the plan and more about listening to what the pond gave her. On cool mornings, the fish fed hard. Before storms, their response changed. When the water grew greener, Emily became careful. Some afternoons she could smell the pond before reaching it, warm and earthy with the faint sourness of heavy algae. The aerators had their own language. A healthy motor sent a steady vibration through the soles of her boots. A bad bearing gave off a thin metallic whine that climbed above the splash. By July, Emily could hear the difference from the barn. Her hands roughened. Sun browned the back of her neck. The notebook pages curled from humidity. Still, the fish grew. Then August arrived under a white sky. Pastures yellowed. Dust followed pickups down gravel roads and hung in the air long after they passed. Corn leaves folded inward by noon. Small stock ponds shrank until dark rings of exposed mud circled their edges. At the Carter Pond, the painted stakes marked the drop. The water level went down. Slowly. Along the north bank, the seep continued. Cold water slid beneath mats of grass exactly where Walter had marked it decades earlier. One advantage had held. Another danger was building. The fish now carried far more weight than they had in April. Every pound of growth demanded oxygen. Warm water held less of it. Emily began checking before sunrise, when oxygen was lowest. For a while, the readings stayed acceptable. Then 3 cloudy days settled over the county. The air felt heavy and still. The pond lost some of its bright green color. On the third evening, Emily threw feed. The response was wrong, not absent, weak. Fish moved beneath the pellets without striking hard. The skin between her shoulders tightened. She stopped feeding. Near midnight, she returned. Grass brushed wet against her jeans. Cicadas buzzed in the trees, then fell quiet as she approached the water. Her flashlight crossed the pond. Shapes disturbed the surface. 1, 5, 20. Fish were rising. Emily ran. The first aerator switch snapped on, then the second. Motors groaned to life. Paddle wheels hammered the pond, breaking the surface into white spray. Wet clay, warm algae, and hot electrical insulation mixed in the heavy night air. The oxygen reading was low. Too low. A second reading confirmed it. The fish had spent months turning feed into weight. Now that weight was consuming oxygen faster than the pond could replace it. Emily moved between the control box and shoreline. Panel. Motor, water, fish. Again. At 2:17 in the morning, the older aerator screamed. Metal against metal. Emily spun toward it. The belt was slipping. A hot rubber smell cut through the damp air. She killed the motor. Half the pond fell suddenly quieter. Behind her, fish disturbed the surface. The tractor toolbox flew open. Wrenches clattered against one another. Emily's hands shook hard enough that the first socket slipped into the grass. She dropped to her knees. The motor housing burned her fingertips. She jerked her hand back, wrapped it in the hem of her shirt, and reached again. The spare belt was wrong. Too long. For several seconds, Emily only stared at it. The flashlight rolled sideways, throwing a pale beam through the grass. 4 months of feed. The banknote. The night at the kitchen table. Her father's empty chair. Everything had arrived at once. Emily closed her eyes, not to calm herself, only long enough to remember. The tractor parts bin. Her father had kept everything. Under 2 rusted chains and an old grease gun sat a tension bracket from another machine. The bolts did not match. Emily forced one through, adjusted the mount, pulled the belt tighter. Her knuckles struck the frame and split open. blood mixed with grease along the side of her hand. The switch clicked. For 1 second, the motor only hummed. Then the paddle wheel turned. Once. Twice. Faster. Water exploded behind it. Emily let out a breath that hurt on the way out. She never left the pond again that night. The tractor idled with its headlights pointed toward the bank. Mosquitoes swarmed around the beams. Her shirt stuck to her back. Every 20 minutes, she checked the motor temperature. Every half hour, the water. Around 4, the air cooled. The fish began dropping away from the surface. A thin gray line formed in the east. Birds started in the tree line one at a time. By sunrise, the pond looked exhausted. So did Emily. She switched off one aerator and kept her hand on the control box. For hours, the night had been motors, splashing water, metal tools striking steel, and fish breaking the surface. Now there was only birdsong. She waited. No fish rose. Emily walked back to the pickup and sat on the open tailgate. Her knees trembled when she finally let them bend. The cut across her knuckles had dried black with grease. Pond water had stiffened the legs of her jeans. When she tried to uncurl her fingers, pain moved through both hands. Morning light crept across the far bank. One dragonfly skimmed the surface. Then another. Emily searched the pond for white bellies. There were none. Her chin dropped toward her chest. For a few seconds, she seemed to be asleep sitting upright. Then her shoulders began to shake. No sound came out. She pressed the heels of both hands against her eyes until sparks of color moved behind them. 4 months of feed had not died during the night. The bank had not won before sunrise. The farm was still hers for one more morning. Emily stayed on the tailgate until sunlight reached her boots. Only then did she stand. The tractor went quiet. Scattered wrenches disappeared one by one into the toolbox. By the time she walked back toward the barn, the pond behind her had returned to something that looked ordinary. For the next 2 days, Emily moved through the farm as if her body had stayed beside the pond. Her hands ached when she gripped a wrench, and when an aerator changed pitch, her stomach tightened. She slept in short pieces, waking before dawn with the sound of splashing water still trapped in her head. At breakfast, she left half an egg untouched and found herself staring at the grease under her split knuckles. The farm had survived the night, but Emily had finally learned how narrow survival could feel. One failed motor, one tripped breaker, 1 hour of deeper heat, and the pond might have gone silent forever. That fear followed her to the bank, the barn, the feed shed, and even the kitchen sink, where the coffee stain still marked the table. She did not erase it. Instead, she folded the stained legal pad and slid it beneath Walter's notebooks, a reminder that the farm had nearly become a memory. On the 3rd evening, she walked to the pond without a meter or feed scoop and stood where the mud had dried around her boot prints. The surface was calm enough to hold the dusk, and for once, she let herself watch it without calculating what it owed her. A fish rolled near the north bank, then another farther out, each circle widening until the water became still again. Emily pressed her sore hand against the fence post and listened to frogs starting in the reeds. For the first time since winter, the silence around her didn't sound empty. It sounded like something had stayed beside her. A few weeks later, the first harvest sample came out of the water. The scale settled above 1.5 pounds. Another fish went on. Then another. The average held. Emily ran a finger down the page of recorded weights. Survival had beaten the conservative estimate. Growth had improved after midsummer. She took out the calculator. This time, when the total appeared, she did not erase it. The first harvest was small. Fish went to a licensed processor, then came back cleaned, chilled, and packed into white boxes over crushed ice. Emily loaded them into the bed of the pickup before daylight. By the time she reached the first restaurant, melted ice dripped through the tailgate onto the asphalt. The truck smelled of cold fish, wet cardboard, old vinyl, and the trace of diesel that never seemed to leave the cab. 1 box at a time, Emily carried the order through the back entrance. Her boots left faint wet prints across the kitchen floor. When the last box was weighed and accepted, a small paper check was placed in her hand. Emily stepped outside before looking at it. Traffic moved along the highway beyond the parking lot. An exhaust fan hummed behind the restaurant. The check was almost weightless. There was no mud on it, no pond water, no grease, no blood from the knuckles she had split repairing the aerator. Just her name, a number, and a signature. Emily rubbed her thumb along the paper's edge. For months, money had moved in only one direction: feed store, electric company, repair shop, processor, bank. Now something had come back. She opened the passenger door and laid the check inside Walter Carter's notebook. It barely covered a fraction of what she owed. Still, before closing the door, Emily looked at it again. The first dollar the pond had ever earned for the Carter family was resting between her grandfather's faded calculations. A week later, the restaurant ordered again. This time, there were no samples. Then a diner in the next town added a weekly order. A fish house across the county line requested larger fillets. The processor began calling before Emily called him. A second check joined the first, then a third. For the first time since winter, the mailbox carried something besides bills. Emily kept subtracting. Feed, processing, electricity, fuel, repairs, transport. Only after every cost came out did the remaining figure go into the ledger. By mid-autumn, the number she had feared all year was finally within reach. One morning, she sat at the kitchen table with the bank statement in front of her. The yellow legal pad from the night she had broken down still lay in a drawer, its coffee-stained figures blurred beyond use. Emily did not take it out. Instead, she wrote a check. Her hand paused above the signature line. Wind shook dry leaves against the porch. Then she signed her name. At the bank, the payment receipt was thin enough to fold in half. Emily carried it back to the pickup as carefully as if it were a deed. She placed it on the passenger seat. Walter's notebook lay underneath. When Emily returned home, the barn still sagged in the same places. The tractor still smoked when it started cold. The south fence still leaned. Nothing about the farm suddenly looked prosperous. But the bank was no longer counting down toward taking it. That difference traveled through the county faster than the original fish story had. Pickups continued to slow on County Road 214. Some began turning into the driveway. Farmers with old ponds walked the bank with Emily, studying the aerators that had once looked ridiculous. Boots pressed into the same mud where the hatchery hose had lain in April. Men who had spent spring watching from the road now bent over Emily's water records. The county agent returned with a notebook of his own. Emily never pointed out the change. She did not need to. The sound of feeding fish carried across the water. The next spring, she stocked the pond again. The first year's profit paid for a better electrical system and reinforcement along the dam. Part of the south fence went up straight. Weak crop ground went into cover crops instead of being pushed through another desperate season. The farm became quieter financially before it became prettier. That suited Emily. Walter Carter's 6 notebooks remained in the kitchen cabinet above the desk. Beside them sat a 7th, then an 8th. Walter's pages had yellowed around the edges. His pencil marks had faded into the paper. On one unfinished sheet was the old sketch of the pond, the northern seep marked with a short blue line and a row of catfish figures ending halfway down the page. Emily's notebook lay open beside it. The date was different. The handwriting was different. Beneath that evening's water temperature and feed amount, she had written the weight of the latest harvest and the number of boxes scheduled for delivery the following morning. Outside, the pond settled into evening. The paddle wheels stopped. Water slipped from their blades in slow drops before the last ripples flattened beneath them. Across the farm, the repaired south fence threw long shadows over the grass. The old John Deere sat beneath the equipment shed with a fresh hydraulic line shining against 40 years of faded green paint. Beside the barn, Walter Carter's 2 pecan trees had grown high enough for their branches to touch whenever the wind came from the west. Something broke the pond's surface. A catfish rolled once in the fading light. The circle widened, reached the bank, disappeared. Emily closed the notebook. She switched off the kitchen lamp and stepped onto the porch. Beyond the yard, the pond reflected the last strip of orange sky. A pickup passed on County Road 214. It did not slow down. Emily stayed at the railing until its taillights vanished beyond the trees. Behind her, through the kitchen window, Walter's old notebook and her own lay side by side beneath the glass. The barn settled with a soft wooden creak. Frogs began calling along the north bank, and beneath the still surface of the pond, another season was growing.